Imagine standing in the center of Red Square. But it is not the Red Square you know from the history books, filled with the triumphant parades of the Cold War. It is January 1947. The air is dead silent, heavy with the scent of coal smoke and unburied dead, save for the rhythmic, terrified crunch of jackboots on hard-packed gray snow. You look up toward the spires of the Kremlin. The glowing red stars, the ruby symbols of the proletariat revolution that once crowned the towers, are gone. In their place, massive gilded swastikas spin slowly in the biting wind, catching the pale winter sun. A Kugelwagen, painted in winter whitewash, idles near the Tsar Bell, its radio crackling with commands in German. This is a world where the Soviet Union did not just stumble, it collapsed into the ash heap of history. A world where the German Wehrmacht was not halted at the gates of Moscow, but smashed through them with mechanized fury, shattering the Red Army and drinking the oil of the Caucasus dry. In this timeline, the Second World War did not end in 1945 with celebrations in Times Square. It mutated. It became a decade-long siege of attrition that turned the European continent into a vast, frozen graveyard. The United States stands alone, an island of democracy, against a fortress Europe that stretches from the Pyrenees to the Urals. The first atomic bomb, dropped on a defiant Berlin, was not the end of the war, but merely the opening shot of a nuclear nightmare. It was not enough to break the iron grip of the Third Reich. This is the story of the fall of Moscow, the moment history broke.
To understand how easily this nightmare could have become reality, we must strip away the hindsight that tells us a Soviet victory was inevitable. We must look at the map in late September 1941 with fresh eyes. The Soviet Union was not just losing, it was hemorrhaging territory and manpower at a rate unseen in modern warfare. In just 3 months, the Wehrmacht had torn through the Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine. They had captured over 2 million Soviet soldiers, an entire generation of young men gone before the first snow fell. The Red Army had lost 20,000 tanks and 14,000 aircraft. The numbers are numbing, abstract statistics, but the reality on the ground was panic, absolute, unadulterated panic. On September 30th, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Typhoon. This was not just another offensive, it was the death blow. The objective was simple, brutal, and seemingly achievable. Annihilate the remaining Soviet forces before the onset of winter and capture Moscow, the heart of the Bolshevik beast. For the single operation, the Germans amassed a force that is almost impossible to visualize today. Nearly 2 million men, 1,000 tanks, and 14,000 artillery pieces, all concentrated on a single objective. It was the largest concentration of military power in human history up to that point, a steel hurricane aimed directly at the Kremlin. Commanding this juggernaut was Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, a Prussian aristocrat who viewed war as a mathematical equation. His strategy was a classic double pincer movement, a Kesselschlacht, cauldron battle, designed to shatter the Soviet defensive lines at Vyazma and Bryansk. And in our timeline, it worked with terrifying precision. By October 7th, the trap snapped shut. The German panzer groups, led by the legendary tank generals Hoff and Guderian, encircled the 19th, 20th, 24th, and 32nd Armies. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. In the Vyazma pocket alone, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded. They fought desperately, trying to break out in suicidal human waves, but they were hammered by the Luftwaffe from the sky and crushed by artillery from the ground. The fields outside Moscow became a slaughterhouse. When the dust settled, the road to Moscow was wide open. Between the German panzers and the Soviet capital, there was nothing. No fortified lines, no reserve armies, just 90 miles of highway and a few scattered militia units, factory workers armed with rifles from the First World War. General Georgy Zhukov, the man tasked with saving the city, recalled this moment in his memoirs with chilling clarity. He wrote, "The defenses in the Urals Line were insufficient to stop the enemy. The road to Moscow was effectively defenseless." This is the first anchor of our reality. The Soviet Union was not saved by a superior strategy in October 1941. It was saved by the clock. The Germans had to spend precious days liquidating the Vyazma pocket, buying Zhukov just enough time to scrape together a defense from nothing. But the margin of error was zero. If the Germans had bypassed the pocket, or if the autumn rains had held off for just one more week, the panzers would have rolled into Red Square before the first snowflake touched the ground.
While the front collapsed, the city itself was unraveling from the inside. We often think of the Soviet defense of Moscow as a unified, heroic stand, a nation rising as one. We picture stoic soldiers digging anti-tank ditches and women sewing winter coats. And that happened. But there is another side to the story, a darker side the Soviet history books tried to bury for decades. On October 15, 1941, the State Defense Committee issued a secret resolution on the evacuation of the capital of the USSR. This wasn't just a precautionary measure, it was an admission of defeat. The resolution ordered the immediate evacuation of the government, the diplomatic corps, and the most critical industries to the city of Kuyyshev, 500 miles to the east behind the Volga. When the news broke the next morning, October 16th, Moscow descended into anarchy. This event is known to historians as Black October or the Big Moscow Panic. For 3 days, law and order ceased to exist. The metro stopped running, the only time in its entire history. The secret police, the NKVD, typically the iron fist of the regime, began burning classified archives in such vast quantities that the sky over the Lubyanka turned black with greasy ash. Thousands of intelligence files, names of informants, and state secrets drifted over the city as charred confetti. Workers, realizing their bosses and party officials had fled in limousines packed with luxury goods, looted factories. Civilians stormed food warehouses, tearing sacks of flour apart in the snow, fighting over sugar and vodka. Cars carrying fleeing party officials were dragged to a halt by angry mobs who accused the bureaucrats of treason, screaming, "You are leaving us to the Germans." It wasn't a city preparing for a glorious siege, it was a city preparing to die. Stalin himself went to the train station. His personal armored train was fueled, engines steaming on the platform, waiting to take him to the Urals. The history of the 20th century hung on that platform. If he had boarded that train, the morale of the defenders, already hanging by a thread, would have shattered completely. Moscow would have been declared an open city, surrendered to avoid destruction. In our timeline, Stalin stayed. He decided at the last second to remain in the Kremlin, a decision that restored a semblance of order. Martial law was declared on October 19th. Looters and panic-mongers were shot on sight, their bodies left in the streets as warnings. The panic subsided, replaced by a grim, fatalistic determination. But notice how fragile this moment is. The government did evacuate. The city did panic. The defenses were broken. The only thing standing between Hitler and total victory was a desperate gamble on reinforcements that were currently stationed 4,000 miles away, guarding the frozen Amur River against the Japanese Empire. The Soviet Union needed a miracle. They needed those Siberian divisions, hardened veterans of border skirmishes, equipped with heavy winter gear. And to get them, they needed to know with 100% certainty that Japan would not attack from the east. In our history, they got that certainty. In this story, they don't.
Our story pivots 4,000 miles away from the freezing mud of Russia to the neon-soaked, rain-slicked streets of Tokyo. It is October 14th, 1941. Deep within the German embassy, a man named Richard Sorge is working in the shadows. Sorge is a complex figure, a functional alcoholic, a notorious womanizer, and a loyal member of the Nazi Party who drives a motorcycle through the streets of Tokyo. He is also the Soviet Union's most effective spy, codenamed Ramsey. In our timeline, Sorge transmitted the most important intelligence message of the 20th century. He told Stalin that Japan had decided to strike south toward the oil fields of Indonesia and the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. He confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union, honoring their neutrality pact. This message was the key. It allowed Stalin to strip the Far Eastern borders bare. He moved 18 full divisions, 1,700 tanks, and over 1,500 aircraft from Siberia to Moscow. These were the fresh, winter-equipped troops that appeared out of the snow like ghosts and stopped the Germans. But in this timeline, the calculation in Tokyo changes. The Japanese Army General Staff, witnessing the total collapse of the Soviet forces at Vyazma and the evident panic in Moscow, argues that the northern strategy, Hokusin-ron, is the safer bet. The southern strategy involves war with the British Empire and the United States, a massive industrial risk. The northern strategy only involves kicking in the rotting door of the Soviet Union. They decide to honor the tripartite pact and strike the bear while it is bleeding. Sorge gets the wind of it. The Kempeitai, Japan's secret police, are closing in on his network, but he manages to rush to his radio transmitter one last time. His hands shake, not from the whiskey, but from the weight of the world. He taps out a message to the GRU in Moscow, but this time the message spells doom. Imperial Conference concludes. Strike South postponed indefinitely. Kwantung Army mobilizing on the Amur River. Attack on Vladivostok imminent. This message lands on Stalin's desk on October 18th. The dictator freezes. He cannot move the Siberian reserves. If he pulls them west to save Moscow, the Japanese will overrun the Soviet Far East, capturing Vladivostok and cutting off the vital Lend-Lease supply lines from America. He is checkmated. With a heavy hand, he orders the Siberian divisions to hold their positions in the east. Moscow must stand alone. We return to the outskirts of Moscow. It is November 15th, 1941. The temperature has dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. The ground is harder than concrete. General Georgy Zhukov stands on the platform of the Peredelkino railway station just west of the city. He is checking his watch, his breath pluming in the freezing air. In our history, this is the cinematic moment where the first trains carrying the Siberian 78th Rifle Division arrived. In reality, the soldiers leapt off the carriages in pristine white winter camouflage, submachine guns in hand, ready to counterattack immediately. It was the turning point of the war. In this world, Zhukov stares down the tracks. They are empty. The steel rails are covered in a thin layer of frost, undisturbed by wheels. There is no steam engine whistle in the distance, no reinforcements, just the oppressive silence of the forest and the distant, thunderous rumble of German artillery getting closer every hour. Zhukov realizes the truth. The cavalry isn't coming. The ragged, exhausted remnants of the Western Front, men who have been fighting without sleep for 3 weeks, armed with Molotov cocktails and obsolete rifles, are all he has left. There is no strategic reserve.
At Army Group Center Headquarters, Field Marshal von Bock receives the intelligence reports from aerial reconnaissance. No new Soviet formations detected. Rail lines from the east are inactive. The hesitation that plagued the German command in our timeline, the fear of the unknown Russian reserves, vanishes. They sense the weakness. The final offensive, Operation Typhoon's second phase, begins not with caution, but with a ferocious, all-out assault. The German 2nd Panzer Division breaches the Istra Reservoir line. Without the fresh Siberian anti-tank units to stop them, the panzers crush the exhausted Soviet infantry, who are freezing in their summer uniforms. On November 27th, the lead elements of the 7th Panzer Division reach Himki, just 8 kilometers from Moscow. In our world, a patrol reached this point and was driven back by a desperate counterattack. In this world, it is not a patrol, it is the vanguard of an entire panzer corps. Through his binoculars, a German tank commander looks east. He sees the golden domes of the Kremlin shimmering in the freezing air. He picks up his radio. Target in sight, road clear, proceeding to enter the city. The battle for Moscow has ended. The siege of Moscow has begun.
The Battle of Moscow in this timeline does not look like the heroic defense of the film reels. It looks like Stalingrad, but compressed into a suffocatingly small urban cage, fought in the dead of winter. It is December 3rd, 1941. The German 4th Panzer Army has pierced the outer ring of the city. There is no defined front line anymore. The war is fought in the opulent metro tunnels, where German stormtroopers battle NKVD squads in the dark, shattering the mosaics of Soviet realism. It is fought in the grand ballrooms of Tsarist hotels like the Metropole and in the frozen courtyards of apartment blocks. The NKVD barricades Tverskaya Street, overturning buses and trams to create burning roadblocks. But without the heavy anti-tank guns from Siberia, they're powerless against the concentrated armor of the Wehrmacht. German infantry, clad in white winter smocks, advance under the screaming cover of Stuka dive bombers. The Luftwaffe, operating from captured airfields just minutes away, pounds the city center relentlessly. The Bolshoi Theater burns, its roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. The Lenin Library is reduced to a pile of rubble. The symbol of Soviet culture is being erased block by block. General Zhukov attempts to organize a final defensive perimeter along the Garden Ring. He demands more men. Stalin, still in his bunker beneath the Kremlin, screams that there are no more men. The relationship between the dictator and his general snaps. Realizing the city is a death trap, Zhukov makes the unilateral decision to save the army rather than the architecture. He orders a retreat to the east, toward Nizhny Novgorod. On December 8th, a half-track from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, smashes through the Tsar Bell Gate of the Kremlin. The footage of this moment would become the most famous propaganda film in history, played in cinemas across occupied Europe for years. German soldiers, filthy, unshaven, and frostbitten, raise the swastika flag over the Senate Palace. Stalin is gone. He fled just hours before the encirclement closed, his armored train racing east into the infinite white void of the Russian winter. But the damage is done. The man of steel ran away. The myth of Soviet invincibility is shattered. The heart of the Soviet rail network, the central nervous system of the entire communist state, is now in German hands. The USSR hasn't surrendered, but it has been decapitated.
The fall of Moscow is not just a symbolic loss, it is a logistical death sentence. Moscow was the hub of the Soviet railway system. All lines, from the north, south, east, and west, converged on the capital. With the hub destroyed, the Soviet Union is effectively sliced into disconnected chunks, unable to move men or food from one sector to another. The first domino to fall is Leningrad. In our timeline, the Soviets launched massive counteroffensives from the Moscow region to keep the German pressure off the north. Here, those offensives never happen. The German Army Group North is free to tighten the noose. The road of life across Lake Ladoga is bombed into oblivion by unchallenged Luftwaffe sorties. By February 1942, Leningrad ceases to be a city and becomes a vast open-air tomb. There is no relief. The city starves completely. When the Germans finally enter the city in the spring, there is no resistance, only silence. The Venice of the North is dead. But the true catastrophe happens in the south. With the Soviet armies in central Russia shattered and retreating to the Urals, Hitler directs his generals to execute Case Blue, the drive for oil, without interference. In our history, this offensive got bogged down at Stalingrad. In this timeline, the logistics hub at Stalingrad is starved of supplies because the rail lines from Moscow are cut. The German Sixth Army doesn't get stuck in street fighting. It bypasses the starving city and pushes straight for the prize, Baku. August 1942. German mountain troops plant their flag on Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in the Caucasus. 2 weeks later, the oil fields of Baku are captured largely intact. The nightmare scenario of the Allies has come true. The Wehrmacht, previously starving for fuel and relying on synthetic oil, now has access to the unlimited oil reserves of the Caspian Sea. The dominoes keep falling. With the USSR effectively neutralized, Japan feels secure in the north. They finally launch their delayed strike on Pearl Harbor in late 1942, or perhaps they coordinate with Germany to squeeze the British in India, cutting the empire in two. But the immediate result is clear. The Eastern Front, the meat grinder that destroyed the German army in our world, has gone cold. Germany has won the war of resources.
We fast forward to the winter of 1945. The war is not over, but the map of Europe has been erased and redrawn in blood. The Soviet Union still exists, but only as a ghost. The Red Army, stripped of its industrial base and its oil, has retreated behind the Ural Mountains. Stalin, now a paranoid recluse operating from a bunker in Sverdlovsk, rules over a frozen, starving rump state. It is a land of desperation, where the remaining industry is buried deep in mountainsides, and the population lives on meager rations of bread and sawdust. The border between the German Reichskommissariat Moskowien and the Soviet remnant is known as the Urals Line. It is a 2,000-mile scar across the Eurasian continent. It is a zone of perpetual low-intensity warfare. German long-range bombers, fueled by the limitless oil of the Caucasus, fly sorties over Siberian cities, reducing them to ash with impunity. The Luftwaffe rules the skies, hunting partisans and supply trucks like sport. On the ground, the Germans have established a network of fortified outposts. They do not try to conquer Siberia. They don't need to. They simply contain it. They treat the Russian East as a hunting ground, a place to test new weapons and train new divisions. Inside the occupied territories, Ukraine, Belarus, and European Russia, the Nazi General Plan Ost is implemented with terrifying efficiency. Without the threat of a Soviet counteroffensive, the SS begins the systematic depopulation of the Slavic lands. The details are too horrific to dwell on, but the demographic map of Eastern Europe is fundamentally altered. German soldier farmers settle the fertile black soil of Ukraine, establishing armed feudal estates, while the surviving native population is reduced to serfdom, working the fields to feed the new masters of the continent.
While the East falls into a dark age, the West faces an impossible stalemate. In June 1944, the Allies launch Operation Overlord. They land in Normandy, just as they did in our timeline, but there's a critical difference. In our history, the Germans kept their best divisions in the East to stop the Soviet steamroller. In this timeline, the East is quiet. The Eastern Front is a garrison duty. Field Marshal Rommel is not starved for tanks. He has 5 extra panzer divisions at his disposal, veterans of the Russian conquest, hardened killers in Tiger tanks. When the Americans and British hit the beaches, they don't break out. The Battle of Normandy turns into a slaughter. The Allies manage to establish a beachhead, but they cannot push inland. The front line freezes in northern France, turning into a high-tech version of World War I trench warfare, with jet fighters screaming overhead. The war drags into 1945, then 1946. The American public is weary. The death toll mounts. But the United States has one final card to play: the Manhattan Project. In August 1945, a lone B-29 superfortress flying from a base in England drops the first atomic bomb. But the target isn't Hiroshima, it is Berlin. The German capital is vaporized. The bunker where Hitler plotted his conquests is turned into glass. The Reich Chancellery is gone. But contrary to American hopes, the war does not end. The Nazi leadership is decentralized. The military command structure is intact. They simply move the capital to Vienna or Munich. Instead of surrendering, the German High Command, now led by a military junta in the wake of Hitler's death, threatens to unleash their stock of nerve gas, taboon and sarin, on London and the Allied beachhead in France. They also revealed their own vengeance weapon, the A-10 ballistic missile, capable of hitting New York, developed with the resources and slave labor of a conquered continent. A cold, terrifying logic takes hold. The Allies cannot conquer a Germany that stretches from the Atlantic to the Urals. Germany cannot invade America. The world settles into a 3-way standoff between the American hemisphere, the German fortress Europe, and the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. By 1950, the Iron Curtain does not divide Berlin. It runs along the English Channel. The world is locked in a nuclear standoff, but one where the swastika flies over the Eiffel Tower, the Kremlin, and the Parthenon. This is the new world, a world without liberation, a world of eternal winter.
This timeline stands as a terrifying monument to the fragility of our own history. We often comfort ourselves with the idea that the Allied victory was inevitable, that the industrial might of the United States and the sheer manpower of the Soviet Union doomed the Axis from the start. But the reality is far more uncomfortable. The survival of the Soviet Union in 1941 didn't hang on inevitability. It hung on a drunken spy in Tokyo sending a single telegram and a few weeks of unseasonable mud slowing down the German advance just enough for winter to catch them. If Richard Sorge had stayed silent, or if the autumn rains had arrived a week later, the swastika would likely still be flying over the Urals today. The world we described, a nuclear stalemate, a starving Europe, a hollowed-out Russia, is not fantasy. It is the mathematical probability of what happens when you remove the Red Army from the equation. It forces us to confront the most debated question of the Second World War. Could the Western Allies have liberated Europe alone? If the Wehrmacht had not lost 4 million men in the East, would the American GI landing at Omaha Beach have faced a wall of steel that no amount of courage could breach? We want to hear your analysis. In a world where Russia falls in 41, does the United States eventually win a nuclear war, or does the world settle into a permanent frozen armistice? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the abyss of alternate history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We have many more files to open. Until then, remember, history is not a straight line. It is a series of fragile choices, and we are lucky to be living in the one where the right ones were made.